Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1952 brought an unusual silence to the remote valleys of Pendleton County, West Virginia. State Route 33, a narrow mountain road that wound through some of the most isolated terrain in the Appalachians, had become the subject of quiet concern among local authorities. Over the course of 18 months, 7 travelers had simply vanished along a particular stretch of this highway, leaving behind abandoned vehicles and no trace of their whereabouts. The disappearances might have been attributed to the harsh mountain terrain, wild animals, or simple misfortune, if not for one peculiar detail that connected each case. Every abandoned vehicle was found within a 2-mile radius of a weathered farmhouse that sat on a hillside overlooking the road, home to an elderly widow named Cordelia Vance. Cordelia had lived alone in the 3-story structure since 1934, when her husband Matthias died in a logging accident. The house, built in 1889 by Matthias's grandfather, stood like a sentinel above the winding road below. Its whitewashed exterior had long since faded to a dingy gray, and several of the shutters hung at odd angles, giving the structure an appearance of gentle decay that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Local residents described Cordelia as a woman of few words who rarely ventured beyond her property line. She maintained a small vegetable garden behind the house and kept several chickens in a coop that had seen better days. Twice a month, she would walk the half-mile down the steep driveway to collect her mail from a rusted mailbox that marked the boundary between her land and the county road. These brief appearances were often the only contact neighbors had with the woman they had come to regard as something of a recluse. The first disappearance occurred in March 1951, when a traveling salesman named Quentin Hartwell failed to arrive at his scheduled appointment in Franklin, the county seat. Hartwell's 1949 Plymouth was discovered 3 days later, parked along the shoulder of Route 33 with the engine cold and the key still in the ignition. His sample cases remained in the trunk, undisturbed, containing an assortment of kitchen gadgets and cleaning supplies. A search of the surrounding area revealed no footprints, no signs of struggle, and no indication of where Hartwell might have gone. The local sheriff, a methodical man named Walter Crenshaw, conducted interviews with residents along that section of road. Most reported having seen nothing unusual, though a few mentioned noticing smoke rising from the chimney of the Vance house during the week of Hartwell's disappearance. This detail seemed unremarkable at the time, as March evenings in the mountains remained cold enough to warrant a fire. 2 months later, a young couple from Maryland traveling to visit relatives in Kentucky experienced similar circumstances. Isadora and Percival Montenegro had been driving through the area when their 1947 Chevrolet was found abandoned in nearly the identical spot where Hartwell's vehicle had been discovered. The car contained their luggage, a thermos of coffee that had grown cold, and a road map with their intended route clearly marked. Like the previous case, there were no signs of violence or struggle. Sheriff Crenshaw began to suspect a pattern, though he struggled to identify any logical connection between the incidents. The victims had no apparent relationship to one another, came from different states, and were traveling for entirely different purposes. The only common element was the location of their abandoned vehicles and the proximity to the Vance property. When approached for questioning, Cordelia Vance proved to be a woman of measured responses and careful words. She claimed to have noticed nothing unusual during the times in question, stating that she rarely paid attention to the traffic on the road below. She explained that her daily routine consisted primarily of tending to her garden and chickens, reading from a collection of books that had belonged to her late husband, and maintaining the house as best she could manage at her age. Sheriff Crenshaw noted that despite her professed isolation, Cordelia seemed remarkably well informed about the details of the disappearances. She knew the approximate dates, the makes and models of the abandoned vehicles, and even some personal details about the missing individuals that had not been widely circulated. When questioned about this knowledge, she attributed it to conversations with the postal carrier, who she claimed enjoyed sharing local gossip during his visits. The subsequent disappearances followed an increasingly predictable pattern. Every 2 to 3 months, another traveler would vanish along the same stretch of Route 33. The victims included a Methodist minister traveling to a conference in Charleston, a widow returning from visiting her sister in Ohio, and a pair of hunters heading to a cabin they had rented in the national forest. In each case, their vehicles were found abandoned, their personal belongings undisturbed, and their fate entirely unknown. As the disappearances continued, rumors began to circulate among the local population. Some suggested that the missing individuals had simply chosen to abandon their previous lives and start anew elsewhere. Others proposed that the treacherous mountain terrain had claimed victims who wandered too far from the road in search of help when their vehicles broke down. A few whispered about more sinister possibilities, though such speculation was generally discouraged by the more rational members of the community. The Vance house itself became a subject of quiet fascination. Neighbors began to pay closer attention to the property, noting small details that might previously have escaped notice. The chimney seemed to smoke more frequently than would be necessary for heating a single occupant. Lights could be seen moving through the upper floors of the house at unusual hours, often in windows that had previously appeared boarded or sealed. Most peculiar was the observation that despite Cordelia's apparent frailty and advanced age, she seemed capable of maintaining a property that should have required more physical labor than one person could reasonably manage. Dr. Silas Whitmore, a professor of sociology at West Virginia University, first encountered the case in late 1952 while researching patterns of rural isolation in Appalachian communities. His initial interest was academic, focused on understanding how geographic remoteness affected social structures and community relationships. However, as he delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding the disappearances along Route 33, his research took on a more urgent character. Dr. Whitmore's methodology was thorough and systematic. He compiled detailed records of each disappearance, created maps showing the exact locations where vehicles had been found, and conducted extensive interviews with local residents, law enforcement officials, and anyone who had known the missing individuals. His files grew to include photographs of the abandoned vehicles, copies of police reports, and transcripts of conversations with family members of the victims. One detail that particularly intrigued Dr. Whitmore was the condition of the abandoned vehicles. In every case, the cars had been found with their engines turned off but still warm, suggesting that they had been driven to their locations rather than towed. The keys were always left in the ignition, and personal valuables remained untouched. This pattern suggested that the drivers had willingly left their vehicles, perhaps under circumstances that seemed non-threatening at the time. Through his research, Dr. Whitmore uncovered several historical details about the Vance property that had not been previously considered by investigators. County records indicated that the house had been built on land that had once belonged to a small community known as Harmony Ridge, which had been abandoned in the 1890s following a series of mine collapses. The original settlement had included approximately 30 families, most of whom worked in the coal extraction industry that briefly flourished in the area. The house itself had an unusual architectural feature that became apparent only through careful examination of the original building plans, filed with the county courthouse in 1889. The structure included a large attic space that had been specifically designed with reinforced flooring and additional ventilation systems. The plans indicated that this space was intended for food storage and preservation, a common practice in rural households of the era. However, subsequent modifications to the house, documented in permits filed between 1920 and 1935, suggested that the attic had been extensively altered for purposes that were not clearly specified in the available records. During his investigation, Dr. Whitmore attempted to arrange several meetings with Cordelia Vance. She proved to be an elusive subject, often claiming illness or pressing household responsibilities, when he arrived at her property. On the few occasions when she agreed to speak with him, their conversations were brief and largely unproductive. She maintained that she knew nothing about the missing travelers and expressed bewilderment at the suggestion that their disappearances might be connected to her proximity to the area. However, Dr. Whitmore noted several details about these encounters that struck him as significant. Despite her claim of poverty and isolation, Cordelia's household appeared to be well supplied with food and other necessities. Her root cellar, visible through a partially open door during one visit, contained an abundance of preserved meats and canned goods that seemed excessive for a single occupant. Additionally, he observed that the house showed signs of recent maintenance and repair that would have required considerable physical effort and financial resources. Most puzzling was an observation Dr. Whitmore made during his final attempted interview with Cordelia in the spring of 1953. As he stood on the front porch waiting for her to answer his knock, he heard what sounded like multiple voices coming from the upper floors of the house. The sounds were indistinct, but clearly suggested the presence of more than one person. When Cordelia finally appeared at the door, she was breathing heavily and seemed anxious to conclude their conversation quickly. When Dr. Whitmore inquired about the voices he had heard, she claimed that she had been listening to radio programs and that the sounds must have been coming from her old Philco radio. The turning point in Dr. Whitmore's investigation came through an unexpected source. While reviewing genealogical records at the county courthouse, he encountered Maverick Tolliver, an elderly man who had worked as a postal carrier in the area for over 30 years. Tolliver had recently retired and was visiting the courthouse to update his address for pension correspondence. During a casual conversation, Tolliver revealed information that significantly altered Dr. Whitmore's understanding of the case. According to Tolliver, Cordelia Vance had been receiving mail addressed to multiple individuals over the course of several years. While postal regulations prevented him from disclosing specific names or addresses, Tolliver indicated that the volume and variety of correspondence suggested that more than one person was residing at the Vance property. He had initially assumed that Cordelia was caring for relatives who had come to live with her, but he had never seen any evidence of additional occupants during his visits to deliver mail. More disturbing was Tolliver's account of changes in Cordelia's behavior and appearance over the years. He described her as having been a relatively normal, if reserved, woman when he first began delivering mail to her property in the 1920s. However, beginning in the early 1930s, she had begun to display what he characterized as increasing eccentricity. She would sometimes appear to be holding conversations with unseen individuals, would occasionally hand him outgoing mail addressed in handwriting that did not appear to be her own, and would often seem confused about dates and recent events. Most significantly, Tolliver revealed that he had never actually entered the Vance house, despite delivering mail to the property for decades. Cordelia had insisted that he leave all correspondence in the mailbox at the end of the driveway, claiming that she preferred to retrieve it herself. On the rare occasions when he had attempted to deliver packages that were too large for the mailbox, she would meet him halfway down the driveway and accept the items there, never inviting him to approach the house itself. Armed with this new information, Dr. Whitmore began to develop a hypothesis about what might be occurring at the Vance property. He theorized that Cordelia might be providing shelter to individuals who wish to disappear from their previous lives, possibly in exchange for compensation or assistance with maintaining her property. This would explain the multiple voices, the well-stocked household, and the ongoing maintenance of the house despite Cordelia's apparent isolation and limited resources. However, this hypothesis raised troubling questions about the voluntary nature of such arrangements. If the missing travelers had indeed chosen to remain at the Vance property, why had none of them ever contacted their families or resumed their previous lives? What could motivate individuals from diverse backgrounds and circumstances to abandon everything they had known? And, perhaps most disturbing, what role was Cordelia playing in these disappearances? Dr. Whitmore's investigation reached a crucial juncture in August 1953 when he learned of plans to widen Route 33 as part of a state highway improvement project. The construction would require surveying the land adjacent to the road, including portions of the Vance property. This presented an opportunity to examine the house and grounds more thoroughly than had previously been possible. Working with the cooperation of the Highway Department and Sheriff Crenshaw, Dr. Whitmore arranged to participate in the initial surveying process. The team included a professional surveyor, 2 construction engineers, and a representative from the county assessor's office, in addition to Dr. Whitmore himself. Their mandate was to evaluate the structural integrity of buildings near the proposed construction zone and to document any features that might be relevant to the highway project. The surveying team arrived at the Vance property on a humid morning in late August. Cordelia met them at the end of the driveway, as was her custom with visitors. She appeared agitated by their presence and repeatedly questioned the necessity of their work. When informed that the surveying was legally mandated by the state, she reluctantly agreed to allow them access to the portions of her property that would be affected by the highway project. As the team began their work, Dr. Whitmore took the opportunity to observe the house and outbuildings more closely than he had previously been able to manage. The structure was larger than it appeared from the road, with additions and modifications that suggested it had been expanded several times since its original construction. Most notable was the height of the main house, which rose 3 full stories above ground level, unusual for rural construction of the era. The surveyor, a meticulous professional named Garrett Pemberton, noted several architectural anomalies that seemed significant. The foundation of the house extended deeper into the hillside than would typically be necessary for stability, suggesting the presence of a substantial basement or cellar. Additionally, the roof line included dormers and ventilation features that indicated a fully developed attic space, rather than simple storage area common in similar structures. Most puzzling was Pemberton's observation regarding the windows. While the ground floor displayed the typical arrangement of windows for a house of its age and style, the upper floors showed evidence of windows that had been sealed or blocked from the interior. Several window frames remained visible from the outside, but appeared to have been covered with boards or other materials from within the house. This modification would have significantly reduced natural lighting in the upper floors, creating an environment that would be perpetually dim even during daylight hours. During their examination of the property's perimeter, the surveying team discovered evidence of what appeared to be a separate entrance to the house. A narrow path, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, led from the rear of the property to a doorway that had been cut into the foundation wall. This entrance was not visible from the main approach to the house and would have allowed individuals to enter and exit the structure without being observed from the road or the primary entrance. The basement entrance was secured with a heavy wooden door that showed signs of recent use, despite the general air of neglect that characterized other portions of the property. The area immediately around the door had been cleared of vegetation, and the ground showed evidence of frequent foot traffic. Most significantly, the door was equipped with hardware that could only be operated from the outside, suggesting that it was intended to keep someone inside rather than to prevent unwanted entry. When the surveying team attempted to bring these observations to Cordelia's attention, she became visibly distressed and demanded that they limit their activities to the specific requirements of the highway project. She claimed that the basement entrance had been sealed years earlier due to water infiltration and insisted that the upper floor windows had been blocked to conserve heat during the winter months. Her explanations were plausible, but her obvious anxiety about the team's discoveries suggested that she was concealing something significant. The most disturbing discovery came when Garrett Pemberton was measuring the distance between the house and the proposed road construction. His calculations indicated that the interior dimensions of the house did not correspond to its external appearance. Based on the thickness of the walls and the spacing of the windows, there should have been significantly more interior space than could be accounted for by the known rooms on each floor. This discrepancy suggested the presence of hidden rooms or sealed-off areas within the structure. Dr. Whitmore documented these findings carefully, photographing the unusual features and recording detailed measurements and observations. However, the legal limitations of the surveying project prevented the team from entering the house itself or conducting a more thorough investigation of its interior. They were restricted to examining only the external features and the immediate grounds around the structure. The surveying project was completed without further incident, but the information gathered during this process provided Dr. Whitmore with compelling evidence that the Vance house contained secrets that had not been revealed by previous investigations. His report to the university and to law enforcement officials detailed the architectural anomalies, the sealed windows, the basement entrance, and the discrepancies in the building's dimensions. However, translating these observations into actionable evidence proved challenging. The missing travelers had never been proven to have visited the Vance property, and there was no legal basis for obtaining a search warrant based solely on architectural peculiarities. Sheriff Crenshaw, while intrigued by Dr. Whitmore's findings, explained that he could not justify more aggressive investigation without stronger evidence of criminal activity. The stalemate continued through the autumn of 1953, with Dr. Whitmore documenting additional disappearances along Route 33, but unable to definitively connect them to the Vance property. His academic reputation began to suffer as colleagues questioned his focus on what many regarded as an implausible theory. The university administration expressed concern about the resources being devoted to what they characterized as speculation rather than rigorous research. The breakthrough came in December 1953 through circumstances that Dr. Whitmore could never have anticipated. A severe winter storm damaged telephone and electrical lines throughout Pendleton County, leaving many rural properties without communication or power for several days. Emergency crews working to restore services discovered that electrical usage at the Vance property was significantly higher than would be expected for a single occupant, even accounting for the large size of the house. The utility company's records showed that electricity consumption at the property had increased dramatically beginning in 1951, coinciding with the first of the traveler disappearances. The monthly usage suggested the presence of multiple electrical appliances and lighting systems operating continuously, inconsistent with Cordelia's claims of frugal living and minimal use of modern conveniences. More significantly, the electrical meter readings indicated power consumption patterns that suggested occupancy of the house by several individuals. Usage spikes occurred at regular intervals throughout each day and night, indicating that lights and appliances were being operated on schedules that would be typical of multiple people maintaining different daily routines. Armed with this evidence, Sheriff Crenshaw was finally able to obtain a warrant to inspect the Vance property. The inspection was scheduled for January 15, 1954, with Dr. Whitmore participating as an expert consultant. The team included Sheriff Crenshaw, 2 deputies, a representative from the state police, and Dr. Whitmore himself. Cordelia Vance did not answer the door when the inspection team arrived at her property. After announcing their presence and their legal authority to enter the premises, the officers forced entry through the front door. The interior of the house immediately revealed evidence that supported Dr. Whitmore's theories about multiple occupants. The ground floor showed signs of recent habitation by several individuals. Multiple place settings had been arranged on the dining room table, with chairs positioned as if a meal had been interrupted. The kitchen contained far more food preparation than would be necessary for a single person, including several large pots that appeared to have been used for cooking substantial quantities of food. Most tellingly, the house contained personal belongings that clearly belonged to different individuals. Men's and women's clothing in various sizes, personal hygiene items, reading materials, and other possessions that suggested the presence of at least 6 or 7 different people. The basement, accessed through the exterior entrance discovered during the surveying project, contained a series of small rooms that had been fitted with basic furniture and minimal amenities. Each room was equipped with a single bed, a small table, and a chair. The doors to these rooms could only be locked from the outside, confirming Dr. Whitmore's suspicion that they were intended to confine rather than accommodate occupants. Most disturbing was the condition of these basement rooms. While they contained evidence of recent occupation, they also showed signs of long-term confinement. Scratch marks on the walls suggested that occupants had attempted to escape or signal for help. Personal belongings found in the rooms could be matched to several of the missing travelers, including a wallet belonging to Quentin Hartwell, the traveling salesman who had disappeared in March 1951. The attic proved to be the most shocking discovery of the investigation. The space had been extensively modified to create what could only be described as living quarters, but living quarters designed for control rather than comfort. The area was divided into several small rooms, each with a single small window that had been covered with heavy curtains. The floors were covered with mattresses and blankets, suggesting that multiple individuals had been sleeping in the space. However, the most disturbing aspect of the attic was the evidence it contained of the ultimate fate of the missing travelers. Hidden beneath floorboards in one corner of the space, investigators discovered personal items that belonged to each of the 7 individuals who had disappeared along Route 33. These items included identification documents, jewelry, clothing, and other personal effects that the travelers would never have willingly abandoned. Adjacent to this cache of personal belongings, investigators found what appeared to be a detailed record-keeping system. Cordelia Vance had maintained meticulous notes documenting the arrival and disposition of each individual who had been brought to her property. The records included physical descriptions, personal information gleaned from identification documents, and notations about the length of time each person had remained in her custody. The records indicated that the missing travelers had not simply disappeared. They had been systematically held captive at the Vance property for periods ranging from several weeks to more than a year. The notations suggested that they had been required to work on maintaining the house and property, essentially providing slave labor that allowed Cordelia to maintain her lifestyle despite her advanced age and limited resources. Most chilling were the final entries for each individual in Cordelia's records. These notations were brief and cryptic, typically consisting of a single word such as resolved, completed, or finished, accompanied by a date. The implication was clear. The captive individuals had eventually been killed, though the records provided no details about the methods used or the location of their remains. Cordelia Vance was discovered in a small room adjacent to the attic, apparently having taken her own life rather than face prosecution for her crimes. She had left behind a detailed confession that provided insight into her motivations and methods, though many questions about her psychological state and the development of her criminal behavior remained unanswered. According to her confession, Cordelia had begun taking in travelers during the economic hardships of the 1930s. initially offering them temporary shelter in exchange for help with maintaining her property. Over time, this arrangement had evolved into a system of forced labor, with travelers being deceived into believing they were temporary guests before being confined and compelled to work for their survival. The confession revealed that Cordelia had developed an elaborate method for identifying potential victims. She would observe traffic along Route 33 and identify travelers who appeared to be alone and unlikely to be missed quickly if they disappeared. She would then create various pretexts for luring them to her property, ranging from offers of directions or assistance with vehicle problems to claims that she needed help with urgent household emergencies. Once visitors arrived at her property, Cordelia would incapacitate them through drugged food or beverages, then confine them in the basement rooms. The victims would be kept in isolation until they agreed to cooperate with her demands for labor. Those who refused or attempted to escape would face increasingly harsh treatment, while those who complied would eventually be moved to the more comfortable accommodations in the attic. The confession indicated that Cordelia had justified her actions as necessary for her survival and the maintenance of her family's property. She expressed no remorse for the suffering she had caused, instead focusing on practical details about managing her captives and maintaining secrecy about their presence on her property. The investigation of the Vance property continued for several months following the discovery of the captive quarters and Cordelia's confession. Despite extensive searching of the grounds and surrounding areas, the remains of the missing travelers were never definitively located. Cordelia's records suggested that she had disposed of bodies in various locations throughout the mountainous terrain surrounding her property, but the specifics were too vague to allow for successful recovery efforts. The case generated significant attention from both law enforcement and academic researchers. Dr. Whitmore's documentation of the investigation became a landmark study in criminal psychology, though he never fully recovered from the psychological impact of uncovering such extensive human suffering. His subsequent research focused exclusively on historical topics, and he rarely discussed the Vance case with colleagues or students. The Vance property remained vacant for several years following the investigation, as the stigma associated with the crimes made it unmarketable. Eventually, the house was demolished in 1962, and the land was sold to the state for incorporation into a wildlife management area. The section of Route 33 where the travelers' vehicles had been abandoned was realigned during the Highway Improvement Project, eliminating the direct view of the former Vance property from the road. Local residents gradually stopped discussing the case as memories faded and new residents moved into the area without knowledge of its history. The official records of the investigation were eventually archived in the state capitol, accessible only to researchers with specific academic or legal interests. By the late 1960s, the disappearances along Route 33 had become a historical footnote rather than a living memory within the community. However, some aspects of the case continued to puzzle those who had been involved in the investigation. The scope and duration of Cordelia's crimes raised questions about how she had managed to operate undetected for so many years. Her advanced age and apparent physical limitations seemed inconsistent with the level of organization and control required to manage multiple captives and maintain the elaborate deception that had allowed her to avoid suspicion. Dr. Whitmore, in his private notes, speculated that Cordelia might have had assistance from other individuals who were never identified during the investigation. The maintenance requirements of her property, the physical demands of managing captives, and the logistics of disposing of evidence all suggested capabilities beyond what one elderly woman could reasonably possess. However, no evidence of accomplices was ever discovered, and this aspect of the case remained unresolved. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Cordelia's confession and behavior presented a complex picture of an individual who had gradually transformed from a seemingly normal rural resident into a calculating predator. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case noted that her crimes showed characteristics of both organized planning and progressive psychological deterioration, suggesting a gradual descent into a form of functional psychosis that allowed her to rationalize increasingly extreme behavior. The impact of the Vance case extended beyond its immediate participants to influence law enforcement practices and academic research throughout the region. The disappearances had highlighted weaknesses in communication between jurisdictions and in the tracking of missing persons cases. As a result, new protocols were developed for investigating patterns of disappearances and for coordinating information between local, state, and federal agencies. The case also contributed to growing awareness of the vulnerability of travelers in remote areas and the potential for predatory behavior to go undetected in isolated communities. The geographic isolation that had allowed Cordelia to operate undetected was recognized as a factor that could enable similar crimes elsewhere, leading to improved monitoring and investigation procedures in rural areas throughout Appalachia. For the families of the missing travelers, the discovery of their loved one's fate provided some measure of closure, though the failure to recover remains left many questions permanently unanswered. Several families pursued civil litigation against various parties they believed had failed to adequately investigate the disappearances, though these efforts generally proved unsuccessful due to the standards of law enforcement practice that existed during the 1950s. The Route 33 corridor eventually recovered its reputation as traffic patterns changed and the memory of the disappearances faded from public consciousness. The highway improvements were completed as scheduled, and the area resumed its role as a transportation route through the mountains. New businesses and residences were established along the realigned highway, creating a landscape that bore no visible reminder of the crimes that had occurred there. Yet those who had known the area during the 1950s occasionally reported an enduring sense of unease when traveling through the section where the Vance property had stood. Even decades later, some drivers claimed to experience unexplained anxiety or discomfort when passing through that particular stretch of mountains, though whether this reflected genuine psychological residue from the crimes or simply the power of suggestion remains unclear. The academic community's interest in the case gradually diminished as new research priorities emerged and the participants in the original investigation retired or died. Dr. Whitmore's documentation remained available in university archives, but few scholars found sufficient motivation to revisit a case that had been considered thoroughly resolved. The criminal justice aspects of the case were similarly relegated to historical status, cited occasionally in training materials or academic papers, but no longer actively studied. In 1967, a documentary filmmaker named Lucinda Cross attempted to create a film about the Vance case, but her project was abandoned when she was unable to secure cooperation from the relevant authorities and surviving participants. Cross had hoped to explore the psychological and social factors that had enabled Cordelia's crimes to continue undetected for so long, but legal and ethical considerations prevented her from obtaining access to the detailed records and interviews that would have been necessary for such a project. The location where the Vance house once stood has been gradually reclaimed by the natural forest environment. Young trees and undergrowth have covered most traces of the former homestead, though careful observation can still reveal evidence of the old foundation and the terraced areas where Cordelia once maintained her garden. The basement entrance, sealed during the demolition process, remains buried beneath several feet of accumulated soil and vegetation. Wildlife management personnel who work in the area occasionally report finding remnants of personal belongings or household items while conducting routine maintenance activities. These discoveries are typically attributed to dumping by previous property owners or to items that were scattered during the demolition process. However, Some staff members privately acknowledge a reluctance to work alone in certain sections of the former property, particularly during the evening hours or in areas where the old house foundation remains visible. The broader community's memory of the Vance case has been shaped by the passage of time and the natural human tendency to transform disturbing events into less threatening narratives. Local folklore has gradually reframed the story, emphasizing the ultimate discovery and resolution of the crimes rather than dwelling on their horrific nature. This process has allowed residents to maintain a sense of security about their community while acknowledging its complex history. Contemporary travelers along the modern Route 33 pass through the area with no awareness of its dark history. The highway improvements successfully eliminated the dangerous curves and sightline restrictions that had characterized the original road, creating a safer and more efficient transportation corridor. The scenic beauty of the Appalachian landscape continues to attract tourists and outdoor enthusiasts who experience the area as a place of natural tranquility rather than human tragedy. Yet, for those who research the documented history of the region, the Vance case serves as a sobering reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist beneath the surface of apparently peaceful rural communities. The crimes demonstrated how isolation and social disconnection can create opportunities for predatory behavior to flourish undetected, and how the trust and helpfulness that characterize many small communities can be exploited by individuals with malicious intent. The case also illustrated the importance of systematic investigation and the dangers of accepting convenient explanations for disturbing patterns of events. The missing travelers might have remained unaccounted for indefinitely if Dr. Whitmore had not pursued his research with such persistence and attention to detail. His methodical approach to documenting evidence and his refusal to accept superficial explanations ultimately led to the discovery of crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Today, the archives that contain the records of the Vance investigation sit quietly in climate-controlled storage facilities, their contents accessible to researchers, but rarely consulted. The photographs, interview transcripts, and physical evidence have been preserved according to standard archival practices, ensuring that future scholars will have access to the complete documentary record of the case. However, the emotional and psychological dimensions of the crimes remain largely confined to the private memories of those who were directly affected by them. The question of whether similar crimes might be occurring elsewhere, in other isolated communities with vulnerable populations, and limited law enforcement oversight, continues to concern criminal justice professionals. The Vance case demonstrated that extensive criminal activity can operate undetected for years when conducted by individuals who understand how to exploit the weaknesses in investigation and communication systems. This recognition has contributed to ongoing efforts to improve missing persons protocols and interjurisdictional cooperation. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Vance case lies in its demonstration of the importance of paying attention to patterns that seem inexplicable and of taking seriously the concerns of researchers and investigators who identify troubling trends. Dr. Whitmore's persistence in pursuing what many initially regarded as an implausible theory ultimately prevented additional tragedies and brought resolution to families who had suffered the anguish of unexplained losses. The mountains of Pendleton County continue to attract visitors seeking natural beauty and outdoor recreation, and the communities that dot the landscape remain largely peaceful and welcoming to travelers. The Route 33 corridor has been transformed into a safe and efficient transportation route that serves thousands of motorists each year without incident. Yet beneath this surface normalcy lies the permanent reminder that evil can take root in unexpected places, and that vigilance remains the price of safety in a world where predators walk among us, hidden by the very isolation and trust that make rural communities so appealing to those seeking refuge from the complexities of modern life.